It's Thursday, January 9th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. We are a quarter of the way through the 21st century. Just do my math there. Lots has happened. I feel lots has happened in the last week, let alone the last quarter of a century. But here's today's conversation. What are the defining moments of the last 25 years? I want your thoughts on this. The lines are open. Yeah, so I mean, today's chat's going to weave our way through from the last 25 years to now to where we're going, right? Even today, looking at the headlines, you've got Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who's on his way out, right? That was the news at the start of this week. He's at the state funeral for former American President Jimmy Carter, as we say goodbye again to another major voice of the previous century, right? New York Times, wildfires ravage L.A. as biggest blazes burn unchecked. Climate change story, big American story right now in the news. Another one, banks are racking up wins even before Donald Trump is back in the White House. Another New York Times headline there. His inauguration is the 20th. Premier Andrew Furey has accepted an invitation to attend the inauguration. Yesterday's show is not lost on me. We did it on Churchill Falls. If we're talking about defining moments, right? The MOU there, potentially defining moment for a Newfoundland and Labrador. But let's take the whole quarter century into account. So we've got Luke Ashworth back here, Memorial University poli-sci prof, international relations expert, and Justin Fentuso, history prof, expert on the modern Middle East. How you guys doing? Happy New Year. Thanks for coming back.
Yeah, no worries. I don't think a hell of a lot's happened in the last 25 years.
Very little.
Really.
We should do 50. Let's do 50.
Let's do 50.
It's nice to be back.
Yeah,
or let's do 25 minutes.
You know, 20, can we fill 55 minutes talking about 25 years? I don't know. I will say this. I have not written Y2K on something in a long time, and I started the notes for today's show of thinking, entering the 21st century. Remember Y2K, the Millennium Bug?
Mm-hmm.
Justin, because you're younger than me, right?
Yeah, no, but I remember it well.
Yeah,
I remember being, I at the time would have been 15. And I remember being at a friend's house for New Year's Eve, waiting for midnight to see, if all of our bank accounts were gonna be drained and we're gonna disappear into thin air because they just couldn't figure out how to put 00 on the end of those accounts.
What a setup for what a weird way to set up a new century, right? Because everyone thought the banks would fail, power outages, transportation system shut down, and then Happy New Year and everything was fine.
Well, there were.
But was it fine?
Yeah. Well, there were a few cases that people got letters dated 1900.
How did they cope?
Well, it was pretty important if it was to do with your pension or something like that.
Touché.
Yeah. But other than that, you're absolutely right. It's interesting what we worried about and what we didn't.
So folks, as we dive into 25 years of history, of defining moments, what they mean, what paths they set us on. If you've got thoughts and you want to join this conversation, give us a call, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. You can text us, 709-327-8206, thesignal@cbc.ca for emails. So when I asked you guys this initially, I think we can line this up way back last year in 2024, what kind of things came to mind about the 21st century and those defining moments? Because there's a few of them.
Yeah, vital list. The big ones, I thought, well, at least the ones that immediately came to mind for me, and the ones that are still playing out. The 2008 crash.
Yep.
We had the acute economic crisis, but we're now living with the political crisis. And in fact, a lot of what's happening, including the election of Trump and things like that, directly lead back to the political crisis from that. The curves. Are we at sort of the end of neoliberalism? The ecological crisis, the transition of Silicon Valley from a group of utopian dreamers to surveillance capitalism, and Elon Musk trying to bring down the British government. The decline of newsrooms, which is often linked to that tech development, and the wars in the post-Soviet space, including Ukraine.
When we say neoliberalism, before I go to Justin, can you give folks because it's floated all the time.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
What is neoliberalism?
It's basically, it's a form of liberalism. There's basically been three sort of historical phases of liberalism. There's classical liberalism, which was undemocratic. That's the kind of the 18th, 19th century. Then you got new liberalism that followed it, which was democratic, progressive, and is what we kind of associate sometimes when we use the phrase liberal politically. And neoliberalism was a kind of a combination of elements of classical liberalism. It's kind of undemocratic nature, but linked to the internationalism of new liberalism. What that basically means, if you want to drill it down, is neoliberalism was a way of kind of internationalizing the economy so that democracy wouldn't be a threat to the free market.
Yeah,
so that's a central element.
So
to
you're
it.
taking democracy, you're taking things like free trade, you're taking stuff that all happened like post, I guess, FDR New Deal stuff as Reagan kind of comes into the States. Like
Yeah, you've got
there.
that kind of new liberalism period. Yeah, you're thinking about kind of the post-war consensus. That all sort of falls apart in the 70s.
Yeah.
And then it's replaced by neoliberalism. So it's the kind of what's associated with Friedrich von Hayek and von Mises and these sort of people.
Stuff
the Austrian school.
And as we start the show talking about the state funeral of Jimmy Carter, this is stuff that Jimmy Carter was trying to look at, and then Reagan took over because Jimmy Carter was just for one term.
That's basically it. Yeah. So as we have this funeral, we're having a funeral from the last president who kind of was in the pre-neoliberal period.
Yeah, that space of are you adapting and are folks listening? Or are they moving into something new? And he only got one term out of it.
He only got one term.
Reagan got a couple. Justin, what about you?
You know, I really struggled when I was thinking about this with trying to not be too, Western centric, too close to my own areas of expertise. It's a struggle I didn't overcome, unfortunately. But I came up with three as well, and some of them actually overlap with Luke's, which are nice. 9/11. I've got dates. I've got the catchy dates for us all. I mean, 9/11.
Yeah.
Absolutely, fundamentally, not only changing for the Western world, for the United States and the American global order, but for the wider world, obviously, as well. We saw the impact of 9/11 across Canada in the months and years following that, the ensuing war on terror, the first time, at least directly, that the United States engaged in regime change in the Middle East. In the 1950s, the removal of the Iranian prime minister at the time was more of a kind of clandestine, behind-the-scenes operation. I mean, this was the first overt
shock and awe. Right?
Shock and awe strategy, remove the Taliban. And then obviously that was followed up then with the war in Iraq, which was also, largely about regime change. And it's just fundamentally shaped the region, I think, in a lot of ways and the globe for the last 23, 24 years. Overlapping with Luke, 11/16, the election of Donald Trump, which I think Luke's right. 2008 kind of set the stage for that. I mean, really, the collapse of the middle class. I mean, people losing retirement incomes in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, and really, especially in the United States, that kind of Midwestern Rust Belt, lower middle class that really was just eviscerated after 2008. Trump comes along 8 years later and says, well, how'd the last 30 years under the Democrats go for you? And a lot of them didn't have very positive responses. And I'll end with another date, a very recent one, but one I think that when the next 25 years are written, will be a really seminal, fundamentally divergent point. 7/10. 7/10/23. The attacks by Hamas in southern Israel out of Gaza, and then the subsequent war in Gaza, which, now, 18 months or so later, has led to the absolute destruction of the Gaza Strip, almost for all intents and purposes, the destruction of Hamas, the at least paralyzation of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Lebanon just elected a new president as well yesterday for the first time in 12 months. Indirectly led to the fall of the Assad dynasty in Syria, which had been ruling there since the 1970s, is maybe continuing to fundamentally change the region as well as it relates to Iran and this kind of Shia crescent or axis of resistance, however you want to term it. So I think in the next 25 years, 7, 10, 23 will loom even larger than it does for me today.
Question, I was thinking of you when I was putting together the list for the show today, right? I'm thinking 2010. I'm thinking December 17th, 2010, a young Tunisian who sold vegetables from a barrow set himself afire to protest against police harassment. That lit the match for what became known as the Arab Spring.
Yep.
How much has changed because of that? Because then 2011, I also have the Syrian civil war begins.
Yeah.
And you look at what happened with the Arab Spring.
Yep.
Influences, impacts for the Syrian civil war, where Syria is now, and you're talking also about Israel, and I mean on the Syria side, there's the Israeli military is also in there. Like there's so much that is connected through like some of these, and then when you, just what you're pointing out for the next 25 years, right? For the October 7th stuff. I mean, there's some of these moments are huge. What are your thoughts on just like the start for the Arab Spring and its importance and its impact?
Not as important, I think, as people would have liked it to have been at the time. You know, there was great optimism in 2010, 2011 that this was going to unleash, a tidal wave of democratic change across the region. The fall of despots and authoritarian rulers and dynasties and kingdoms that had been in place for decades and decades and decades. It didn't quite have that effect. It obviously, as you said, Adam, it put us on the road towards what's happened in Syria over the last 4 weeks. But it certainly wasn't quite A to B. There were a lot of pit stops on the way.
More A to Z, right?
More A to Z with a stop at L and return to B and then down to S and back and forth. But it definitely set us on that path. I think where people will look at the Arab Springs, even in the next 20 or 25 years, and as the region continues to maybe democratize or normalize relations with Israel or the United States or come more under kind of the American global security umbrella, we might revise our attitude towards that time period as well. We might start to see it more as the beginning of a long process of change in the region, right? One that didn't quite have acute change, but one that had long-term change. But I think of states like Lebanon. I think of states like Egypt. I think of states like the Gulf states, Bahrain, the UAE, et cetera, where the impact, the consequences of the Arab Spring were very uneven and still are. Egypt still doesn't really have a functioning government and is still more or less ruled by a strong man. Like we mentioned before, Lebanon just elected a president after failing 12 times over the last 2 years or so to elect one. It had that impact on Syria, but in the Gulf states, I mean, you still have I think Luke would agree with this. You still have kind of a plutocracy that rules the Gulf states, and really in a lot of ways a kind of first-class, second-class economy where local Emiratis or Bahrainis or Qataris live very well, but imported Southeast Asian migrant workers.
They basically import their working class.
Yeah, right, exactly, right? I mean, this is why they can get away with having no tax. I mean, they don't pay them much anyways. So the larger regional impact was not as transformative, I think, as both the protesters, the peace activists, the democratic activists had wanted it to be. And frankly, to Luke's point as well about kind of the reach of neoliberalism, I don't think it was also as transformative as the Western world would have liked it to have been, to open up those markets to the West, to democratize, to bring them into the global order more robustly.
Here's one, and Luke, I mentioned it to you before the show started, Justin, before you got here. If we're going to talk about timelines diverging, right, for the 21st century, starting, I know I mentioned Y2K, but just past that, the year 2000 election, Bush versus Gore. Bush won with 271 electoral votes, one more than the 270 required to win. Gore won the popular vote by it was like 544,000 and change, right? A margin of 0.52% of all votes cast. Here's something from...
The hanging Chad.
This is what I was going to get at, right? The hanging Chads in Florida. So here's a couple lines from its Political Science Quarterly, Gerald M. Pomper, summer 01. The presidential election of 2000 stands at best as a paradox, at worst as a scandal of American democracy. Democrat Albert Gore won the most votes, a 500,000 more than his Republican opponent, George W. Bush, but lost the presidency in the Electoral College by a count of 271 to 267. Even this count was suspect, dependent on the tally in Florida, where many minority voters were denied the vote, ballots were confusing, and recounts were mishandled and manipulated. And then it all came down to the Supreme Court, a 5-4 majority decision, which Mr. Pomper says, but by a 5-4 majority of the unelected U.S. Supreme Court issuing a tainted and partisan verdict. Now, I mean, you can take issue with how that's framed or whatever, but that's just imagine a world where it was 5-4 the other way. Right? What where would we be if Al Gore was president as opposed to George W. Bush?
Well, we might have had Elon Musk a decade earlier.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, right? Yeah. On the climate file, a lot friendlier for Elon Musk.
Yeah. I mean, that was the big thing with Gore. I mean, was his, we're kind of an early innovator in terms of climate change. So there's always that. I mean, it's always dangerous to talk about, and I know historians hate it when you're talking about the whole.
Yeah, we're not good at this.
Counterfactual
Just
history.
Don't stop.
Yeah, the historians start getting sort of sweaty palms on this one. But I think
just the temperature.
Yeah, but it is something. I mean, in both of our disciplines, there tends to be a heavy emphasis on structure and how structures kind of mean that things end up what they are meant to be. But I think it's telling to sometimes realize that actually a hell of a lot of what happens in the world is the result of luck. Yeah. And in this sense, the existentialists were right. There is this sort of powerful luck element that exists.
Place and timing, right?
Place and timing, yeah.
Place and timing, and also I think the kinds of individual baggage that decision makers bring to the table that you don't even know is influencing their thought process. And you only tend to get insight into that sometimes when you read, either their memoirs or the memoirs of those who were close to them, or the recollections of diplomats who were sent on missions by them and, had conversations behind the scenes that were never official policy or official government directives. And that's where you get those little moments where, I didn't know Bill Clinton thought that way, or I didn't know George Bush brought that decision, that baggage to the table.
There's a very good example of that with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, on the start of the First World War, had come out the year before. President Kennedy had just read it.
Oh, wow.
Just before the crisis. Yeah. So you have a situation where a book by a popular historian on the start of the First World War and the disaster of the diplomacy influences a president who's dealing with nuclear weapons.
Well, you catch the folks who've talked about, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, Obama making fun of Donald Trump. And there's some folks who are like, that's the whole reason why he ran. Yeah, which is, I mean, who knows? Probably not. But an interesting, again, if you're to talk about defining moments, if that really was the case, that's fascinating, right? One or two jokes fewer, and the Republican Party doesn't completely change over the course of the last however many years.
Yeah, we get a Bush running instead against Hillary Clinton.
Oh, and to go back to Adam's question, the happenstance and with Gore and Bush, one of my big events is 9/11. Yeah. Right? Yeah. If we have Al Gore as a president, and again, not to get too deep into the counterfactuals, we are not good at these things, but it does a 9/11 still play out? When it plays out, I mean, the reaction you would have to think certainly would have been different. I don't think that a Democratic party in power run by Al Gore would not have responded. But I don't know if it necessarily would have been the full-scale invasion of Afghanistan alongside NATO forces.
Probably not Iraq. Afghanistan,
almost
probably,
certainly not Iraq.
But certainly not. Yeah.
Almost certainly not Iraq. And you actually, speaking of that baggage, there's a great book called The Interrogation, and it's by one of the CIA interrogators who interrogated Saddam Hussein. And he relates all of these conversations he had with Bush at times. And also in Aaron David Miller's book, The Much Too Promised Land, he also talks a lot. It's about Israeli-American diplomacy. And he talks a lot about the conversations he had in the early Bush years, in the early 2000s as well. And the degree to which Bush was motivated, if the inner circle story, as we're talking, the degree to which Bush was motivated by the belief that Saddam Hussein had tried to have his father killed, and that was also part of the decision to invade Iraq and facilitate regime change. You only get that story in these little inner circle anecdotes, memoirs, recollections. He never would say that in the public, right?
No.
This is for Dad.
And for what you're saying too, like for me listening to it, thinking, so folks in their backstories, things that have happened, whether it's a book they read, something because of, well, actually he tried to kill my dad or whatever. And then the ramifications for the rest of, in this case, these people in these positions, and for what it can mean for the world, like for the Iraq War, the estimate, I'm looking at a BBC story, 461,000 people died in Iraq from war-related causes between 2003 and 2011. And the war cost, and this is a couple of years ago, I think, for this piece, U.S. American dollars, $3 trillion.
Yeah. Some of the casualty figures I've seen actually place it as high as $1 million.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
like so,
civilian deaths was horrendous. Yeah.
And you look at 9/11. You have the Canadian forces. 158 Canadian soldiers died during the Afghanistan mission over time. Then plus again civilian casualties in Afghanistan, and just the repercussions of what that has meant to individual families, communities, countries. Right, big things happen, and then it the folks it impacts. It's just so large and sometimes so staggering. Like what's going on now in the Middle East, right? With the crisis in the Middle East, it can be, I think, so hard to even sit down and kind of take it all in and understand it, because it's just so much. The numbers are so high.
It's remarkably challenging. It's something that historians, political scientists, I think anybody in our kind of humanities, social sciences discipline. It's a real struggle to try to put your finger on the pulse of whatever you want to call it, public opinion, popular opinion, how people are affected by things. And it's something that I think we have to realize as well. I mean, it changes 1 minute to the next, 1 year to the next, 1 decade to the next. How someone felt about an event. If you asked a Canadian Armed Forces member, say, that was part of the NATO mission in Afghanistan, how they felt about Kandahar in the mid-2000s, how they feel about Kandahar now, 20 years later.
I have, and it's different.
You're getting different stories, right? I mean, you got 20 years of time, of the passage of time, of different events to influence the opinion, was it worth it? Was it not worth it? Has things changed? So when you ask that question is really critically important, and then you ask it at different times, you get different answers.
Well, we last year, right, the passing of former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Now, I'm old enough, I was a kid, but I'm old enough to remember him being really popular to not popular at all, right? And him leaving, Kim Campbell coming in, and then the party getting decimated in the polls. But then in recent years, they'll look back at his time a lot more favorably compared to folks, right? Like you said, when you ask the question is such an important thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I was a kid at the time, but Carter.
Yeah.
President Carter went from being a hate figure, more mush from the wimp, I think was one headline. He was deeply unpopular at the end of his term. That's why he lost to Reagan, to an elder statesman and a national treasure.
Yeah.
It's the same guy. But that changeover is quite dramatic.
I think with Carter, just for a quick moment here, I think with Carter, it also matters if someone's died. When someone dies, the perception tends to change. Either the wolves come out of the forest sometimes.
Yes, as happened with Margaret Thatcher after
as happened
death,
with Margaret Thatcher, as has happened with many military generals, politicians over time. Winston Churchill is a decent example of that, actually. In the case of that early 80s, and Carter in particular, I think as well, I think what people didn't like him for in 79, 80, by the kind of nearing the end of his term, is actually what people like him for now. This kind of thoughtfulness, this gentility, the Southern gentility of his, kind of almost indecisiveness at times because he's so thoughtful and articulate.
Which didn't go down well at a time when things were going very badly with relationships with the Soviet Union, the invasion of Afghanistan,
the Iran hostage crisis.
He looked vacillating.
Exactly. Yeah. You wanted that political figure that projected confidence and power, and dare I say, a certain kind of masculinity. And Jimmy Carter wasn't quite that. I mean, he was like a Bill Clinton to the extreme, come into the office, I'll talk to you for 3 hours instead of give you a one-sentence answer.
Yeah. And he put solar panels on top of
I was going to say
the White
House.
Yes,
he did. Yeah. And then Reagan tore them down.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, they needed them for Star Wars at the time.
They did indeed.
You're listening to The Signal, and today on the show, look, it's a new year. We're having a conversation about, we're a quarter of a century into the 21st century. We're talking about the defining moments of the last 20 25 years. And that means, we're spilling back to the 20th century and it's going to spill ahead to what might be to come and what to look at, right? The lines are open, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. If you've got thoughts for us, I'm going to hit pause on the conversation for a second because Arlette Lazarenko is here with us in the studio. Arlette is the associate producer for the next few months on the show, while Amanda Gear is off on the national show Unreserved. Arlette, welcome. You're here to talk about yesterday.
Yes. So yesterday's show, we spoke about the ongoing debate about the Churchill Falls MOU. It was the second episode we had on the topic.
Yeah, that's right. Because before Christmas, we had execs from NL Hydro, right? Jennifer Williams being one of them, in to talk about the initial take on things for these negotiations that have been a few years in the making, apparently. Mm-hmm. So we did that, and then yesterday we had some of the critics on.
Yeah. So we had two guests on our show yesterday, Des Sullivan, a former civil servant and a politics blogger, and Gabe Gregory, an independent management consultant. There was a lot of talk, a lot of things to say, some hope, a lot of concerns, and we had some messages that we just didn't have time to air.
And you're going to talk about these messages. Who's up first?
That's right. So we had an email from Atilia Russell. She says, my question for the government is, if this deal is so good, why the rush to push it through the House of Assembly? And why are you so afraid of an independent panel reviewing the MOU? If this deal is as great as the government says, surely they would welcome an independent panel proving them right. So, Adam, on the same line of questioning, we got another email, this time from Pat Barron. Pat says, what are the reasons the Premier, and I guess the governing Liberals, is offering as to why there won't be an independent review? And what is the rush? For some reason, I am reflecting on the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
And I know you've got also, so there was those two, right? These
Yes.
questions over independent review. But then there's something as well about...
Well, before we go to that, Adam,
yeah, sure, go for it.
We had a little update on the situation because these two emails, asking for a review, those are something that's been asked very vocally by the opposition.
Yeah.
But today, 5 minutes before the show, we got this little update. Yes, that the government announced a new independent 3-member expert panel to review the MOU. And they will also provide oversight of the ongoing negotiation with Hydro-Quebec. They still don't know who exactly, but they know that they're going to be an independent panel.
Okay, well, thanks for updating on that. And you've got one other piece of from the show?
Yes, sure. I got another message was left yesterday, right before we were about to end the show. We got a caller, Daryl Goff from Gander. He called us, so I'm paraphrasing his points. He said, AI is in big use right now and will keep growing. And one thing about AI is that it consumes a lot of energy. And what do we have? We have energy. So AI might be the market we can leverage.
And that fits in with what longtime economist Doug May was saying on the show yesterday as well. And is that it from yesterday?
Yes, that's all we have.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Arlette, very much, folks. So anytime you have thoughts for the show, you can catch previous shows on the CBC CBC Listen app. We're also on CBCNL's YouTube channel because we often have the cameras on here for shows. And if you want to get in touch with your thoughts about future shows, this show, yesterday's show, any show, the signal at cbc.ca. Back to our guests here in the studio. So thank you very much, Arlette Lazarenko. With that, let's get back to talking about the defining moments of the 21st century so far. I've got Lucian Ashworth here with me in the studio, a professor of international relations, Justin Fantuzzo, again, a history prof, expert of the modern Middle East. Folks, if you want to join the conversation, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. We're asking about the defining moments of the last 25 years. So for when you're in your departments, right, how do you, as history happens, right, as stuff unfolds, how do you kind of, because like Justin, you're saying it depends on asking the question, right? So how do you kind of take stuff in for thinking like, well, this is there's going to be books on this. This is something we're going to talk about for decades to come because it might just be or is a defining moment.
I think there's two ways of approaching that in my discipline anyways. I'm sure it's the same in Luke's. I think on the one hand, if it's something that's close to your research area, you might immediately be thinking about, how can I chip in?
Yeah.
That's exactly it. Actually, for any listeners who are students, particularly undergrad students, have probably noticed, when they do a course that's directly linked to a professor's research, there's something fresh and exciting about it.
Tends to be a bit of a better course sometimes.
It tends to be a lot better course. And because, I mean, students pick up on that, on the fact that the professor is kind of engaged. And I think it is very, very important that we do that we kind of link that research to our teaching.
I think so too, and Luke kind of rolled into what I was going to say as well. Was you think what can I maybe contribute to this? Is there a project I can massage my way into? But B, I often think about, okay, how can I teach this? How am I going to teach this? How is this going to fit into any of the courses that I currently do? I'll give you an example. I'm teaching the modern Middle East right now. As of yesterday, it started. Yeah. And the focus this semester is entirely on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we start with October 7th, 2023. And we end with October 7th, 2023 in a way, and the question of, where do we go from here? So you're always trying to find ways to bring your own content, your teaching up to speed with what's going on in the world. Because, I mean, frankly, I think if we're not, what are we doing?
What's the point?
Yeah, what are we doing? I mean, then it's just history for history's sake.
And I think, there is that feedback. It's... the one thing about teaching is that it isn't a one-way street. The thing is that we're always taking cues from the students. I mean, one of the reasons that I kind of moved into teaching my End of the World course and doing a hell of a lot more on the ecological crisis was because, students were asking, what the hell was international relations saying about the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, microplastics? And, to be frank, it wasn't saying a hell of a lot.
No.
So it kind of pushed me to both research in that area, but also to teach. So,
what, to get back to the kind of main point we were making before about it depends when you ask the question. It depends on which cohort of students you're asking that question to.
Oh, yeah.
Every 4 years or so, when that new cohort kind of flips over, students have learned to learn in a different way. The pandemic, created a whole new set of challenges for professors post 2021, 2022. What Arlette was mentioning, I mean, AI is posing a whole new set of challenges for us. We might in the next 25 years wipe off some of the big points we're talking about now, and AI might replace those on the most important kind of events in the first 25 years of the century.
I do actually teach it as the last part of the last class in the main section I have on current threats. I do AI.
You end with Terminator 2.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Although, actually, the more I do it, the more myself and the students go, actually, this isn't as big a threat as thermonuclear war or climate change or biodiversity. But it is good to do it anyway.
Sure.
Yeah,
We've got Jeff Windsor on the line, calling from St. John's. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, guys. Listening to the conversation, enjoying it.
Thanks.
For the last 25 years, major events, impactful events. I'm not sure. I missed one small section of the show, but I hadn't heard up to now anybody mention COVID and the pandemic. But that surely has been a major event that has a huge impact on shaping the way the world is today, I do feel.
Oh, Jeff, 100%. So it was on my list because and to bring you're into the conversation. But when I was planning the show yesterday, Jeff, we were talking about it in the newsroom, and my colleague from Weekend AM, Heather Barrett, because I was like, I said 9/11. I said Facebook. I talked about the Arab Spring, and she's like, and COVID, Adam. I'm like, yeah, the pandemic, of course, because it's so even though we're talking 2020, massive timeline change on this, right? It's such a big deal. And so, Jeff, what do you where do you think the pandemic? I mean, massive loss of life, the shutdown, the reopening, changing of political systems or political feelings and thoughts, and different elections. What do you think some of the impacts have been from it?
Well, you hit on a couple of them, but I definitely see rise in the mistrust of governments and information provided by governments, the rise of conspiracy theories, and so there are two main things that I've noticed. Extremism, I guess, as a whole, seems to have increased from the fear and anxiety that was caused by COVID.
Yeah. Jeff, thanks so much for this call and for putting COVID into the discussion, because obviously, yes, the pandemic in the last 25 years, a major major event. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm enjoying the political discourse. Well done, guys.
Thanks, man.
It's funny, isn't it, how quickly we put COVID in the rear view mirror.
Yeah.
But I think Jeff is spot on. I mean, if you relate it to political changes, the mistrust of government, conspiracy theories, all of those kinds of things. I mean, we've seen a wave of right-wing, kind of sort of conspiratorial governments that at least position themselves as kind of, anti-establishment across the globe in the last 3 to 4 years. It's not just the re-election of Donald Trump. Austria just elected its first far-right government since the Second World War.
Well, they're in negotiations.
But I mean, it could still happen. Governments like Viktor Orban's in Hungary, other governments in Central and Southeastern Europe also moving towards the right. I mean, Italy, for example, has maybe not a far-right government, but a right-leaning government. The kind of revitalization of political parties like Le Front National in France. I mean, I think Jeff's right. I think it's had a really serious impact, particularly on those political parties that position themselves as anti-establishment.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The one thing, though, and it maybe comes back to the issue of why we left it off, is there seems to be something about pandemics that we try to forget. I mean, a good example of this, for a long time, particularly from about the 60s onwards, there was a lot of talk about the lost generation of the First World War. Yeah. And it was certainly the case, lots of jurisdictions, but here particularly in Newfoundland and Labrador. But interestingly enough, Spanish flu killed twice as many people as the First World War in half the time. And that's the conservative estimate. Yet Spanish flu had kind of disappeared from the kind of public memory in a way that the First World War hadn't. And it's the same way why, there were certain kind of incidents that we push to the front and others that we push to the back. A good example of that is, I remember during the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, people were scared of going to Northern Ireland because they were terrified of being killed. Yet, the deaths on the road were 10 times the murder rate. Right. You were more likely to get run over by a Northern Irish driver than you were to die. Yet people were terrified of the paramilitaries and not of the cars. So there's something that goes on in terms of our minds and perceptions of threat.
And just to say for folks, and this is not to say that COVID is not with us still. Granted, 2023, the World Health Organization declared that COVID-19 no longer represents a global health emergency. They have not declared an end to the pandemic. And, the estimates around deaths, I'm just looking at some of my notes here. I think it was around, the head of the WHO last year said, 2 years ago now, at least 7 million died in the pandemic. But there's estimates that it could have been closer to 20 million deaths, and they still say the virus in 2023 and remains a significant threat. So just a bit of extra context there. But but when you talking about war, fighting against what you would call an enemy, stories can be made out of that.
That's right.
But when it's folks dying because of an illness, it's hard to have stories yes, the frontline staff and the doctors and the nurses and everyone else, they are heroes, to talk that language. But I think it's a harder narrative sometimes than say, hey, here's my great so-and-so's medals that we still have. Right?
Yeah, I think that's
you don't get the medals rack from the Spanish flu.
Yeah, I think, it is interesting what terrifies us, and it's not often what is actually the biggest threats. Yeah. It
reminds me of the Jerry Seinfeld joke about public speaking being the number one fear, and death was number two. And his joke was, people were more afraid to give the eulogy than to be in the casket.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. There's an element of that. There's something in the human makeup.
I think you guys are both onto something, though, in the sense that, there's something peculiarly tragic about major conflagrations, about major conflicts, especially large international ones like the First World War, the Second World War. For a long time, obviously, we've known that those two conflicts have very different public profiles as well. Right? The First World War very much kind of thought of as the senseless, futile war. It's hard to wrap your head around. The winners, losers aren't as clear. The Second World War is very obviously in the aftermath of the Holocaust becoming more widely known. I mean, very obviously the Good War, right? Yeah. Stopping Nazism, prematurely ending the Nazis' plans for the eradication of all of Europe's Jews. You're easily able to distinguish the good one from the bad one. But the ones that I think particularly have a kind of sense of folly to them, a sense of tragedy, like the First World War, like the Vietnam War. I mean, no one really talks about Korea.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, because it went too well.
War.
Yeah, it went too well. But we all talk about Vietnam because it went so badly, right? We don't really talk about Gulf War I because it went really well. We talk about Gulf War II because it went so badly. There's something about folly, about tragedy, about mismanagement, about not understanding why people have died. I think that really grips people. Whereas COVID, you understood. I mean, it was obviously tragic. But you understood what was happening to an extent, right?
Right.
And I think also, it's just kind of occurring to me now, I mean, this idea of the lost generation that was so prevalent throughout the empire and then the Commonwealth in the aftermath of the First World War, just as prominent as it was, here, it was just as prominent in Britain,
yes,
especially.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, COVID is our generation's lost generation. Yeah. I mean, we don't have a major global conflict to point to. Like the start of the 20th century, the middle of the 20th century. We don't have a Vietnam. Iraq now is 20 plus years ago. Yeah. Afghanistan's 20 plus years ago. In a lot of ways, COVID might very well be remembered as our generation's lost generation.
So what are you noticing then? Because earlier in the show, we talked about the cohorts, right? Every 4 years, a new cohort of students comes in. And now we've got students in university. There's just headlines that pass by me. You're seeing stuff of attention spans are down. Students who may or may not be able to do the readings for university courses because of some of the impact perhaps from the pandemic and also the social media world that we live in. What are you noticing with this cohort for what they're saying or how the behaviors are that may have been different from previous ones?
But I think that was moving in that direction anyway. Yeah. Because but I think COVID maybe was a catalyst.
Right.
But we had been moving that with the sort of the new media, the sort of the tech industry and so forth, new ways of knowing things. And it has been a challenge. I mean, Justin was talking earlier about AI, and we immediately think of ChatGPT that we're all reacting to now and thinking of new ways to deal with our courses. But we've been doing that really for the last decade with really playing catch up with what we give in terms of readings and things like that for classes. Because it's not that the attention spans necessarily have gone down, but people look for knowledge in different places. And so when I was going to university, it was all written. Yeah. And and it was usually very long and very dense things that we were quite happy to read. But now I do find myself, for example, setting documentary films if I want students to kind of get prepared to discuss something. Oh, right on. And even actually sometimes docudramas or things like that. So I set Threads, the 1984 film on a nuclear war, to talk about thermonuclear war. I've set the film Fog of War, which is about Robert McNamara, to sort of talk about the issues of war and guilt about war,
and maybe lying about
and
war.
Lying. Yes, exactly. Well, let's not go that far. Yeah.
If we're talking about McNamara,
sure. We don't want to get sued.
Kissinger wasn't any better.
Kissinger was worse. Yeah.
And they're dead.
Yeah. So, yeah. See, as we said earlier, now the wolves can come out.
And the big word, maybe.
Maybe.
Doing a lot of lifting there. Yeah. What about you, Justin?
It's really challenging to get a grip on each new cohort's style of learning. I'll say can be very challenging. I think the new group of students they're very enthusiastic, very engaged. I think they want to know, whereas I think in our generation of being at university, I think there was a feeling of at times kind of, well, you were studying things to study things. And that was the end purpose, in fact, right? That was the goal. I think students now need, and maybe rightly so, more of a reason to be doing what they're doing than students had in the past. They need you to connect it to something that matters, or at least you need to have a go at explaining that. And I'm not sure previous generations needed that as much. Whereas I think they not only crave it, I really do feel like they need it to be motivated and to feel a connection to the work that they're doing. I think social media has been a big disruptor, as Luke pointed out. And just kind of mass media in general. Now, there's two ways you can cut that, right? I mean, on the one hand, you can say, has it decreased attention spans? We might disagree slightly on this. I mean, maybe. I think anecdotally, probably a bit. But it's so fundamentally changed where they can get their information from. Like, you as the instructor are no longer like the font of knowledge.
Yeah, you're not the knowledge keeper.
No. You're the arbiter more so now, right? Like, it's your job to find what's good, to wade through the bad.
So you're like back when we used to talk about like news aggregators. You're like the aggregator. It's like Justin Fantuzzo was actually my modern Middle East aggregator.
You're chief editor for the course, right?
And also because they have access to all this knowledge on their phones, you can be real-timed fact-checked.
Oh yeah.
And actually I've started to use it so that when I have a lecture and I kind of forget something like a date or whatever, I will go, okay, who's got their phone? Because I want to check up the date on that.
Yeah.
Or,
that's nice.
when did Ursula Le Guin die? And someone will go, oh yeah, got it. So you can actually, you can, on the one hand, it can be a kind of a threat. But on the other hand, you can actually use it and make it a kind of an interactive tool.
Yeah, and if you want to as well, if you're interested in making that connection between historical events or political events and the world we live in now, or how people are interpreting those events as well, the beneficial side to that mass media, to the social media, is if you create assignments in the right way, you can have assignments tap into that public opinion. I mean, go tell me what's on this subreddit, for example.
Exactly.
Wade through that. I mean, find the forums. What are people saying about these things? What is the conversation? 30 years ago, you didn't know.
No.
You knew what the conversation was in your circle. You knew what you were hearing anecdotally from other people. You knew what you read or what you saw, but you couldn't find a centralized reservoir of public opinion, or at least public opinion as people choose to express it. You can now.
So then when the course that for Modern Middle East, they started yesterday, when you're teaching October 7th and you know that you're going to get a lot of different opinions from students, and it could depend on where they grew up. It could depend on their inputs, outputs, whatever. How do you kind of how do you put all that together for a class to digest and to, like, on one side mounting calls of genocide, on another side vehement denials from the Israeli government? How do you put all that together? And I know that we're getting down there in time, and you're like, Adam, stop asking big questions at the end of the show. But we've got 8 or 9 minutes.
This is the day I don't teach Adam. I don't want to think about teaching. Briefly, I think this is something that all of us try to be sensitive to, especially when we're teaching sensitive subjects. Yeah. They're emotionally charged. People are passionate about them. They come with strongly held convictions, sometimes for the wrong reasons, oftentimes for the right reasons, sometimes for the wrong reasons. What I always try to do, and what I'm especially trying to do in this course this semester, because it's still ongoing, right? I mean, there isn't a resolution that I can look back on and say, okay, well, when we get to week 14, I'll tell you how it ends. I can't say that. But what you do try to do, I think, as any good educator does, there's a line that you straddle between fostering an open dialogue in class. You want people to be engaged. You want people to be passionate and enthusiastic about being in class, because you hate when they're not. You want them to be. But on the other hand, you have to be careful not to establish an environment in which people don't feel comfortable expressing their opinions. In other words, you want to set a cordial environment. You want to establish a cordial environment. So, you've got to be very clear about what the boundaries are for the language that's being used, about what's acceptable language. And that's not to stifle anything, but that's just to say, look, remember, there's 40 of us here in this room. Yeah. And people are coming to this discussion with different baggage. And there are right ways and there are wrong ways to go about discussing this. I want to do this the right way because I think fundamentally doing it the right way leads to a productive conversation. You'll learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. There has to be rules of the road. And this is, coming back to sort of recent events, this is why the news about Meta getting rid of its fact checkers is actually a problem, is that, you don't actually foster free speech and free exchange by getting rid of rules. It's in fact in creating those rules to allow for different voices to come forward, that you make a difference. And so, yeah, I'd link that back to, and that's why Meta is making a big mistake.
I was listening to a podcast by Ezra Klein yesterday, just talking about burnout, and part of it was just, look, they were talking about schools at one point and saying, like, while it can be good for sometimes, you give students a break on something or a free class, but you still need structure, because if not, you can't just have people going in and out whenever they want, because then nothing, like, there needs to be a certain amount of structure, a certain amount of rules, and then you can have some freedoms within it so that you can get to where you're trying to go for conversations.
Yeah, and fundamentally, I think that's also setting up an equitable situation. I mean, you want everybody to be playing by the same rules, because inherently then it is an equitable situation. Everyone knows what the boundaries are, everyone knows what the rules are, and everyone can then participate in a way that is, fundamentally the same as the next person. So I think that's inherently fundamental to what you're doing.
Yeah.
And is it because of how connected we are? Like, when we joke at the beginning of the show, it's like, 25 years could have been the last 25 minutes, right? When we talk about the defining moments, because it feels like there's so much news, but lots of stuff happened in the 20th century. Right? There was no shortage of stuff. A couple world wars, bunch of other wars, right? Like a lot, like the Great Depression. But it's not now when we're all connected to each other. So when something happens, when the incoming president of the United States says something on any number of ways, that reverberates so much faster than it used to. Is that what it is? I'm just kind of curious of your thoughts there.
Yeah, well, even then, I mean, the sheer volume can also mean that we miss things. I mean, one of the things we're not talking about is what's going on in Sudan.
Yeah,
we're not really talking about Myanmar either, which is in a civil war. There's actually a lot of things we're not talking about. And this kind of constant chatter actually can push things off. I mean, the fact that, I was doing VOCM and CBC yesterday, as we were talking about the Trump press conference, and we're talking about Greenland and the 51st state that Canada will become, blah, blah, blah. What we weren't talking about was the really awful fires in California. Now, those were on the news, but they were kind of pushed off the kind of chatter online because there was this other story. So
defining moments, it depends on who you are, where you're sitting from, and the time that you're thinking of it for how it matters to you, right? Like, for my time in Tokyo, you talk about they have 3/11, right? The earthquake, tsunami, nuclear disaster.
Right.
Yes,
not as much of a defining moment if you're in St. John's, Newfoundland, but but massively impactful for folks in that region.
Yes, very good point.
Yeah, and I think there's an idea in history about speed.
Yeah,
the speed at which society kind of digests events, processes them, makes them part of their collective memory, chooses to remember them or not. And I think there is a case that, things have felt sped up the last 30, 40 years. Yeah. You're kind of jumping from event to event to event. But kind of to Luke's point, was it not always the case? And to your point, Adam, and we just didn't really know.
Yeah, no.
Right? We weren't really privy to the change that was always going on. I mean, now you just are. You're just overloaded with it. So the speed of change, the speed at which you move from Myanmar to Sudan to Gaza to Ukraine, it's hourly almost, right? I mean, something is changing every hour, and that's in some ways very great for an academic. Yeah. And in some ways, it's incredibly challenging because you don't know where to stop. You don't know where to end.
No, exactly, right? Because there's just so much all the time. Right?
Yeah,
Thanks for bringing up Myanmar, because it's just one of those things where in a previous years before, something that would be in my newsfeed, right?
That's it.
Right, Aung San Suu Kyi. That's a name that in the 20th people knew that name, and now I haven't heard that name.
Well, in Sudan as well, officially now being recognized as a genocide.
Yes,
by the United States. So big changes.
And we haven't even talked about South Korea.
Right.
No, exactly, right. Attempt at martial law. They had one president, and then the acting president gone, and now they're trying to find now the Constitutional Court. Two impeachments, and the Constitutional Court is deciding what happens next. And the question is, does this strengthen democracy or does it hurt it? It looks like for now it might be strengthening it, depending on
at least in terms of the crowds that have turned out in the streets in protest. I mean, what a powerful representation of democracy at work, of the people's voice being heard.
That it's a country that fought hard for its democracy for what it has, and if you mess with it, they will kneecap you.
Yeah.
Not in the Irish document, not in the Irish rap documentary.
No.
way.
But it's a good point as well. You know, democracy isn't just about voting.
No.
Democracy may be staying up all night to make sure that the armed soldiers don't get into the Parliament.
Exactly.
building.
And then when they go through it half-heartedly. Yes. Gosh, we're out of time. Thanks, guys, for this.
Pleasure.
Luke Ashworth, Joseph Fantuzzo, thank you again. Folks, if you have thoughts on defining moments of the last 25 years, email us, thesignal@cbc.ca. Tomorrow on the show, very different. Music. Think school bands. Think music ensembles on stage with 10, 20, 30, 50 musicians. They all have one thing in common, the love for music. What brings them together is that beyond their backgrounds, their language, their looks, if they can play, they belong. We are exploring that conversation tomorrow because music, it creates community, it helps people express themselves, and it also helps people heal. Don't miss tomorrow's conversation, only on The Signal.